What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions for Stalker 2. The next entry in the, I would say, relatively cult classic status of the Stalker franchise, and frankly, something a little bit different for myself. So I've been interested in this basically since they announced it because it looked really cool, and I had been briefly acquainted with other Stalker games. I have not played them extensively, mind you, but I had heard good things, and this looked cool. And since it launched just a couple of days ago, I decided to go ahead and pay for it and jump in and check it out. Now that obviously means I did not receive a review key, but very broadly I would say that the general consensus around this game a few days out from release seems to be that it's a cool game buried under a lot of different technical problems. And I would have to say that that largely sums up my own first impressions of this one. I'm having a good time, but there's a lot of problems. Now, ironically, when the reviews came out for this one, that was minus the day one patch, so I think those reviews actually encountered more problems overall than I have, and channels like Digital Foundry, for instance, have taken a look at it since that day one patch and kind of given an update on the technical side of things. But speaking for myself, the most serious issue I ran into was a soft lock on the main quest. I had to actually load an autosave from like 30 or so minutes prior in order to fix it, as a specific objective for a mission relatively early on simply did not want to complete. Beyond that, everything else was basically just visual stuff. The occasional character floating off, problems with menus being a little awkward sometimes, but that's definitely the main thing. Now, I did want to mention one other thing here, and I don't know if this is a bug per se, more just an observation of something that might just need some tuning. Stalker 2 here is a, survival open world FPS, which means in theory you should be running low on supplies, but supplies seem to be everywhere. Like, enemies will spawn in, they're relatively easy to kill, and they have just tons of supplies on them. And I actually checked out the Steam forums and a couple other places to see if this had been an experience other people were running into, and it would seem that is the case. So I'm not sure if this is intended, or if there's some kind of bug causing supplies to just drop, constantly, because this seems to be the case even across, different difficulties. And it's definitely making the game easier than what it would seem like it was intended. But other than that stuff, let's get into the rest of what this game is about. So we play as Skiff, who has their house burned down by an anomaly. Anomalies typically come from the zone, or, the area around Chernobyl. But for some reason, this one did not. It just showed up in your apartment building, and you, as a result of this, hitch a ride over to the zone to investigate and see what's going on here, which sees you in the tutorial or prologue setting up a scanner and taking some readings before ultimately being attacked and that scanner being stolen from you, and you having to, of course, come to in order to track down the people that attacked you, which forms the bulk of the story. Now, the really interesting thing to me about the story has yet to fully come into fruition, but there are indeed parts of it already visible, which is that the story is intended to be non-linear, with you encountering all sorts of factions that will, of course, potentially be affected by you, and you can actually choose between them in some cases. But apparently, even if you do, nothing, they're still supposed to, react and, maybe change leaders and stuff, fight amongst themselves, that kind of thing. And I'm curious to see that bit of the game itself in full swing, because it's an interesting concept. Even right away in the early game, you are actively choosing between two different factions. For instance, the Ward, which are like a police force that has come to the anomalous zone in order to basically bring it under their heel. And then you have a faction of just, generally the Stalkers themselves trying to appreciate the zone for what it is rather than more or less try to conquer it, and you'll meet further factions along the way. So that's the part I'm most interested in seeing, and obviously when I finish the game, probably multiple times decide with each faction, we'll see what happens there. Now, progression-wise is also pretty interesting, because where I play a ton of RPGs, where doing things like leveling up and acquiring skills is a big deal. Stalker 2 is mostly just about finding and upgrading your gear. This includes weapons as well as armor. Now, this is important because that obviously makes it easier to fight and kill things, but also protect yourself from enemies, but also environmental hazards like the anomalies, which are generally to be avoided. But you're going to find this gear generally, some of it can be crafted, I believe, but then you upgrade that gear. For guns, this means just upgrading various parts of it, adding mods like silencers and scopes and stuff, which are actually pretty customizable. You can find all sorts of mods out there and then attach them directly to weapons to increase the usual stuff, ammo capacity, recoil, etc. And then your armor in particular has a bunch of different slots that can be adjusted, which will allow you to do things like, say, carry more relics, as the zone is known for its relics, and realistically are probably going to be a primary source of money for you, as you tend to find them in the heart of anomalies, and you can then sell these relics for cold hard cash, by which I mean digital coupons, to potentially get some of that gear. But that gear progression alongside just general knowledge of the zone itself and, how to explore and what each anomaly does, what enemies do, how to avoid them, that kind of stuff is really what progression is all about here, which has so far been pretty enjoyable, especially against the backdrop of the zone. Now, I want to start this little section with a quick note about the sort of visual identity of the zone. So far, I've played for about 10 hours, and most of it has just looked exactly the same outside of some buildings, and I'll be curious to see when the game starts offering more diverse environments to explore, because I realize this is, effectively just one area in the world, so you're not exactly expecting entirely different climates here. But for instance, I know there was a swamp shown off in some of the pre-release material, and hell, even a larger town would be nice to explore at this point. But otherwise, exploration and combat and gameplay and all that is surprisingly tense. For starters, it's easy to get swarmed if you get a little too far ahead of yourself, and because of that, this game plays fairly slow for a game like this. It has a lot to do with preparation and choosing your avenue of attack, so to speak, in a way that almost makes it feel more like a stealth game at times, because you're spending so much time trying to parse through each of these things. But along the way, we're exploring these big open areas. We can come across random events and stuff, including interactions with various enemies, which can be a little frustrating. They seem to spawn right on top of you sometimes. And then there's side quests and things like that to get up to alongside the main story missions. So I think exploring a lot of that stuff and seeing what it has to offer is probably the part of this upcoming review that's going to take me the longest. But another thing I'm really interested in checking out as I review this one is the enemy AI. So each different type and grouping of enemies is meant to act differently. For instance, the dogs and a lot of the mutants themselves try to swarm you and do these little hit and run tactics where they'll run in, take a swipe at you, and then run away, which can make it hard to, target them, for instance, which is another reason trying to catch them unaware tends to be more helpful. And then later on, when you start fighting more elite enemies, I'll be curious to see if their actual tactics change, or if it still feels pretty much the same. But when you throw a lot of that stuff together, there seems to be plenty of room for potentially emergent gameplay situations to crop up, which I imagine is where a lot of the longevity and interest for a game like this is going to come from. So hopefully all of that winds up being fun. So as I move to review this one, that's more or less what is on my mind. I think it does a lot of really cool things, just the moment-to-moment gameplay, but also the interactions with people during cutscenes seem to be really well choreographed, I guess you could say. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. So hopefully as I do that, things like bugs, etc. won't be too much of a problem, and we'll kind of go from there. I have no idea how long this is going to take me to finish. It seems like I'll have to play through it probably a couple of times at least, so I can experience different parts of the story from different angles and stuff as you meet these factions. So we'll kind of see what happens there as I go, but that's kind of where my head's at the moment, which is as good a place as any to wrap up this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.